Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for showing up for another Ask Leo Live. Today, I want to play with some partitions. It's a question that I get relatively often, particularly in recent years when new machines and upgraded machines often result in a hard disk being laid out with multiple partitions of, well, not really knowing what they're for and whether or not you even need them. I'm not going to necessarily answer those questions, although we'll touch on what a couple of the partitions are and aren't. But more to the point, I'm going to look at using Windows' own disk management tool to manipulate some of the partitions, delete some, create some, move some around if I can. And then, since it does have some shortcomings, I'm also going to fire up a third-party disk partition management tool, in this case EaseUS Partition Master, I think it's called, and do a couple of the things with it that you can't necessarily do with disk management, and at the same time look at what are some of the differences that it has between its free and paid versions. I'll talk more about the third-party disk management tools as we get a little closer to that. So what I'm going to do is, let's go switch over to, there's the machine we've been using for these things. This is a Windows 10 Home Edition machine. Right-click on the Start menu and click on Disk Management. And I'm going to make that a little bit bigger because you can see I've actually done a couple of things in preparation for this. Let's go ahead and do that. So what we're seeing here is 3 hard disks on this machine. This would be the equivalent of having 3 internal hard disks on your regular PC, whatever kind it is. I'm doing all of the manipulations on the other 2 hard disks. The first one that's listed here, disk 0, this is the system drive, and while we can do many of the things, or actually all of the things that I'm going to discuss, on the system drive, it'll actually be a little quicker and a little easier for us to play with the a secondary drive, or as you can see here, a third drive, so that we're going to end up avoiding a few reboots along the way. So the second drive here, the second and the third drive, disk 1 and disk 2, are configured identically. That's because one is actually a clone of the other. I used cloning software to create the second or the third from the second. They have 5 partitions each. Now, this is very common, I'm finding, on Windows machines that have been upgraded. They will often have as many as 5 partitions when they, when you actually take the time to look at it. One of the partitions will usually be very large. In fact, if we take a look at the actual system drive here, I've got 580 megabytes here of a system, of this partition, this first partition. At the end, I've got another 561 megabytes, but in the middle, I've got close to 100 gigabytes. And literally what this is a 100 gigabyte drive, of which 1 gigabyte has been shaved off at the front and the back for whatever purposes. There's this huge partition in the middle that is the drive we interact with, the drive we care about. And you can see it's even labeled as the C drive here because that is this machine's C drive. These drives here are manufactured, but they're manufactured to be similar to what we're looking at, to the kinds of things we might find. Again, we've got the small partitions at the front and the back, and then I've got 3 other partitions along the way here. The sizes are actually somewhat immaterial because when you have an upgraded or an installed Windows 10 machine, you may find that in addition to your big primary partition, the partition that contains your Windows installation, there's often a fairly large-ish partition, say 10 gigabytes or less, that contains what they would refer to as the recovery drive. It's actually a full copy of Windows ready for reinstallation. I've just arbitrarily set a few different file size or partition sizes here. This one's 39.3, this one's 20.5, and this one is 39.09. So the question that I get the most often is, I've got these partitions, do I need them? The short answer is, before you even start asking the question, back up, right? If there's nothing else, you want to make sure you have a copy, a backup image of the entire drive. And that includes all the partitions, whether you understand their need or not. We're going to make some decisions here based on a couple of random, I'll just go ahead and call them guesses. But if for whatever reason we choose wrong and delete a partition that turns out our system happens to need, it's your backup image that's going to get you that partition back. The backup image will contain an image of the entire hard drive. Now, I do want to be sure that when you make a backup image, you're not just, for example, on this first drive, you're not just backing up C. You're using your backup image software to image the entire disk, all of disk 0 in this case, which would include all 3 partitions on it. If you take a look at any of the making an image articles that I've got, some of them include videos, and they all explicitly back up the hard disk, not just the partition. So the first thing we're going to do is, I'm going to decide, well, actually, before we even do that, one of the things that helps people decide whether or not they need a partition is looking at its contents. Now, in this case, on disk 1, you can see that it has arbitrarily assigned some drive letters to some of the partitions. So, for example, A, I can take a look at A if I want to. I've fired up Windows File Explorer, and you can see that A has, well, it has some stuff on it. Not a lot. It certainly doesn't have Windows, but it does appear to have some boot information, the system volume information. This isn't running as administrator, so I probably don't have access to any of these. But the point being that this then does indicate or would at least lead you to believe that this is some kind of a recovery partition. These are just data partitions. They're clones. The first one is a clone of my C drive. The others are empty. This other one at the end, though, is one that tends to confuse people. Whenever you see a drive that doesn't have a drive letter associated with it, not always, but sometimes you can go ahead and, well, we're in one of those not always cases here. This is one where you can't assign a drive letter. We could, for example, on this one, on the C drive, or I'm sorry, on disk 0, we could in fact assign a drive letter, but in this case we cannot. Down here, these then I would take to mean that these are somehow partitions related to your UEFI BIOS, more detailed recovery partitions, just things that aren't intended to be accessed as a normal file system. Normally, not knowing what's in there and considering that the size is very small compared to the rest of the hard disk, I would be very tempted to just leave that partition alone. I can't get into it. It's not taking up that much space. Is there really any benefit to getting rid of it? And the short answer is typically no, it's safer to leave it there. We still can get rid of it. We may need to use third-party tools to do that because, as you can see, we had no options when I right-click on that partition. There's nothing I can do to that one using Windows' own disk management tool. So these other partitions, I do want to point out one thing that is a little bit confusing. You'll notice this says recovery partition. These others actually have some names associated with primary partition. There's more than one primary partition, which is confusing in and of itself. You would think a primary partition, there could be only one. In fact, what it boils down to is that disks using this particular layout, I believe these are MBR formatted disks, can have only 4 primary partitions. And in reality, that's typically more than enough for most machines. And in fact, you'll see that disk 0 here has only 3, and they are all 3 primary partitions. As soon as you want to have a fifth partition, what ends up happening is an underlying partition. If you look carefully, you can see that there's a green border around these two partitions. That is in itself a partition. It's a basic partition. And this basic partition, which is not a primary partition, can contain many different partitions themselves, and those are all called logical drives. So we have here a primary partition, and then a primary partition at the end, but then we also have this basic partition in the middle that itself then contains two logical drives. One that's been formatted and one that is just an empty drive. So that tends to confuse people from time to time, but that's how it ends up. For the most part, the distinction between primary and basic and recovery and active and system, for the most part, it really doesn't matter, especially if all you're intending to do is reclaim disk space. So let's reclaim some disk space. The way to do that, what most people are interested in doing is taking their C drive or whatever their primary drive is on their system and merging these other partitions into it. Now, with Disk Manager in Windows, you cannot merge partitions without losing the data in one or both. That's just a limitation of the tool. So if you've got all of your data backed up, which I know you do, then the thing to do is simply right-click on one of the partitions and say delete volume. In this case, it's going to warn you that deleting this volume will erase all the data on it. That's the point. That's something that I want to be clear about. Whenever you delete a volume, it's going to erase all the data. And now you can see that it's been changed into what's called free space. This is unpartitioned disk space. We could create multiple partitions here if we wanted to, but that's not what we want. What I want to do instead, I've got this other drive here. I'm going to also delete that volume. Same thing, we're going to be erasing any data that might be on that volume. Now in this case, I have that exposed in my system as drive F. So drive F is going to disappear and all the data that might have been on drive F will be erased. Now you can see that it's been merged into this single chunk of free space. Finally, this free space, which is now itself essentially kind of a partition. You can see it's still got that green border around it. It's not labeled as a partition, but you can see you have the option of deleting the partition. That's exactly what we want to do. We're going to go ahead and delete this partition. Poof. Now we truly have unallocated space following the partition we want to keep. This is a scenario where you can, in fact, simply extend the volume, extend the partition into the unallocated space. This gives us a wizard that steps us through this process, but it's really a short process. The default is to use up all of the allocated space. You can see here that it's listed as 61010 megabytes, which when you do digital math, when you do computer style math, is the same as 59.58 gigabytes. We're going to use it all. So we'll click on Next and perform the operation. Now you can see that the B drive is bigger. It now contains all of the data it contains all of the data that it did before, but it just has a whole bunch more free space. So what we've done is we've merged, by losing the data, but we've merged those other two partitions into the B partition, into the primary partition on this machine, without losing any of the data on the B partition. That simply got extended. Now the other scenario is more problematic, and that's this one. We've got A over here. Let's say we don't want it anymore. So we will go ahead and delete it. Same thing, deleting a partition means we're going to delete all of the data in that partition. Now we have 580 megabytes of unallocated space in front of our B partition. Guess what? There's really nothing you can do. Extending it won't work because there's no space after it. I've come to a stop because the tool seems to be implying that I can do something I didn't realize I could do. Again, the thrills of live video. I'm going to go ahead and walk through this and we'll learn this one together. 578 megabytes kind of implies that it's about to use up this unallocated space. So let's see if that's what it's going to do. Right, it's going to basically, this is something that for the most part, the difference between basic and dynamic disks are not something that you necessarily need to be concerned about. It is something where sometimes there will be a conversion necessary, as in this case. And there's not enough space. As I suspected, it kind of alluded to it being possible to do what I was about to do, but of course it can't. So the interesting thing here is that we are now left with, if all we're going to use are Windows tools, we are now left with this unallocated space in front of our primary, the primary partition on the machine that we can't use. We just can't use that partition because we have no way of incorporating it into the partition we want to use. The only thing we could do is to create a new volume, right, which creates a new partition out of the empty space, assigns it a drive letter, and now we have a drive that's, 578 megabytes, but it's not what we wanted. We didn't want a separate drive. We wanted that to be part of the B drive, the original drive here. By the way, this one in its, I just noticed, this is something worth noting, that when we merged these partitions for this drive here in the center, we lost our drive letter. What that means is that we need to go back and simply add a drive letter. And I'm going to go ahead and let it be, actually I'll go ahead and let it be B since that's what it was when we started. It claims that B is still assigned, but I'm not seeing it anywhere. This is one of the things that it's just sort of interesting troubleshooting when you run into these very obscure kinds of things. You can see that this status is basically duplicating the information that we have here. It tells us the file system, and you can see there's no B listed here. What I'm actually going to do is rescan the disks. Rescan is a useful tool that basically causes the disk manager to go through and walk through all of the disks and all of the partitions and recalculate exactly what it is you have. And you can see that while the drive letter may have been lost in the display, it had not actually been lost. The drive letter had still been assigned. So rescanning is another useful thing to realize or to understand exists in Disk Manager simply because it can repair some of the display issues that Disk Manager might occasionally have. So to get back to what we were talking about, what we've been able to do so far is delete partitions or delete some of the partitions that follow our main partition, our working partition on a hard drive, and then merge those partitions into that so as to make their space available to it. The main partition does not lose any of its data, but the other partitions had to be deleted and turned into free space before the space could be merged into the main machine or main partition, and that implied that any data that was on those partitions would be lost. We're also in a situation where we've got a partition up front that we can't merge in. We could use it if we wanted to, but we can't really merge it into our main drive like we'd want to. And we have this partition at the end that we can't seem to do anything with at all. So those are all limitations of Windows' own disk management tool. They've been around forever, and in fact, I think that we could do a couple of the things we did here so far are in fact new. They've actually added some functionality to the tool. But as soon as we start getting a little bit more serious about what we want to do with disk partitions, it's very quick. It becomes very quickly obvious that we need another tool. There are many. There are many that are free. I'll show you one here in just a second. The free tools boil down to, I'll put them into two separate buckets. One is that the tool itself is free. It does a number of important and useful things, but it doesn't do everything. And that's the situation we'll find ourselves in here in just a minute. There is, of course, an upgrade path where you can buy the full-featured pro version of a tool that will do pretty much everything you might ever want to do, and do it with a pretty reasonable interface as well. It's still partition management, so it's still kind of magically geeky, but it is something that is within the grasp of someone who's willing to sit down and take the time to learn it. The other scenario are the truly free tools, which can be full-featured, but can be exceptionally geeky. There's one specifically, I'm not going to show it to you today because it'll just scare you, is called gparted. Gparted is the default partitioning tool in Linux. And in fact, the approach to using gparted to resolve these kinds of issues, which I've done, it has been in the past my go-to tool because it's something that I'm comfortable with, is to actually boot the machine from a live Linux CD or USB, and then run gparted from Linux, and then have it manipulate the hard disk that's installed in the machine. That works really well. You can do pretty much anything you might ever imagine wanting to do with hard disk partitions. But as I said, as with so many things Linux, I keep coming back to the term geeky. It assumes two different things. It assumes a level of knowledge, but also assumes some familiarity with how Linux approaches hard drives, which is different than how Windows does. It's closer actually to how a Mac deals with hard drives. But as it turns out, not only is there just terminology differences and interface complications, there's actually this conceptual model that's a little bit different in Linux that can make it not obvious exactly what it is you want to do and how to translate that from our Windows list of partitions that we have here on the screen to what a tool like gparted will show you. So if you're interested in the advanced and completely free version, that's the approach that I would recommend. It's going to take some education. The barrier to entry there, to put it one way, is higher than the tools that we're about to look at. So let's go back and look at this tool that I'm talking about. I'm just going to go ahead and close Disk Manager and run instead EaseUS Partition Manager. Now, EaseUS may sound familiar because I often also talk about their backup utility, EaseUS To Do. EaseUS is out of China. They are a very good and very affordable tool, a set of tools. And in fact, they've got get all of our tools for one low price for life thing that I think in my situation probably makes sense for me to pull the trigger on. I'm explicitly running the free version right now because I believe that, again, if Windows Disk Manager doesn't meet your needs, then a free version of a tool like this might very well be more than likely to cover whatever it is you're attempting to do. There are several different products in this space. There's EaseUS has one, Paragon has one, there's a couple of others that are out there. In a lot of ways, It's kind of like how I've described the difference between my recommendation of EaseUS To Do and Macrium Reflect. They're both really good programs. They come from different places. EaseUS from China, Macrium from the UK. They cost a little bit different. Macrium tends to be a little bit more expensive. But the fundamental difference in terms of functionality boils down to, well, your comfort level. Some people find the EaseUS interface and way of doing things more comfortable than the Macrium one. Macrium people may feel that that one is more professional or more, it's easy for them to understand what it is they're doing. In other words, personal preference. So when it comes down to these name brand partition management tools, I kind of fall back into that same recommendation. There are several that are good. The free ones all have this same kind of limitation where there are features that they hold back for a paid upgrade. But the free version does a lot. And very often, a lot is enough. Now, in the case we're showing here, you can see that I've just fired up the free version. It's giving me a countdown, of course, to give it some immediacy with an offer to upgrade to the pro version of the tool. I have the option of not showing it again. I left that unchecked specifically so that it would happen here because I wanted you to see that this is the kind of thing, and given my history with EaseUS, my guess is that not showing this again, they will find another way to make this offer to you. I know that you have the option of signing up, or maybe it's not even an option. When you download the free version, one of the things you do is you give them an email address. And they will then promote their product and their offers. The one thing that I do like about EaseUS, even though they do send out a fair amount of promotional material, they pay attention when you unsubscribe, but very often you don't want to unsubscribe because those promotions are actually often really good. This 40% off, there's a good chance if I do nothing in a couple of weeks, there'll be another email promotion with something very similar, saving you that same kind of money should you decide you want to go to the pro version of the tool. So that's one of the reasons that I would recommend if you do, if you download one of the free versions of these tools, regardless of who they come from, with the intent of evaluating it or understanding whether it's going to meet your needs, and you think that it may someday even be worth a few dollars, if it doesn't meet your needs, to find a tool that does, give them your email address or look them up, or just remember to go back to them and consider that their paid version may be something that you might want to get in the future. But for the moment, we are going to run with the free version of EaseUS To Do. So what you can see here is a list that's very similar to what we saw in Disk Manager. The partitions are listed twice. This upper part lists them as a list with each disk 1 or 0, 1, and 2 enumerated the way they were. The partitions, again, listed with their sizes and so forth. And then down here, I'm going to scroll this up to make it a little bit bigger and scroll the window wider to make it a little bit bigger. And down here, we've got this graphical representation of the partitions on the machine and on the disks and how they're laid out. Very, very similar in concept and perhaps a little prettier than the Windows Disk Management tool. So there are some interesting things that are different. For example, this partition that we couldn't do anything with, now all of a sudden we could do things with it. I could add a drive letter to it if I wanted to, of any of the ones I care about. Down here on the drive, disk 1, where we're actually making changes, if I wanted to, I could delete the partition, which is something I was unable to do before. Now, so again, we've already stumbled onto a very simple feature in the free version of this partition management tool that Windows' own Disk Manager wouldn't let us do. So we've got this unallocated space here. Now, I could extend this right away, but I want to point out one difference in the way almost all of the other partition management tools work. this graphic has been updated to reflect that I deleted this partition at the end of the drive. In reality, nothing's happened yet. The way these tools tend to work, and Windows Own Disk Manager is an exception, is that you give them a series of instructions. So I've given them one operation. In fact, you can see the list so far in the upper left-hand corner of the tool. It says delete partition G, which is what drive letter had been assigned, on disk 1. It hasn't actually done it yet. The idea is, I'm going to go ahead and have it do this here in a second, but the idea is that you build up a list of things you want done. It shows you what the results will be as you build that list, but then it's not until you actually say do it that the tool performs the task. So I'm going to go ahead and say execute the one operation, delete the partition G on disk 1. We will apply. And it's done. This is now unallocated space for real this time. We have no operations pending, so this is an actual live representation of what the disk is. Now, so we've got this partition. It's drive letter B right now, and it has some free space at the beginning, and it has some free space at the end. What if we could right-click on it and just say, where to go? Resize and move. So what we're looking at, this top part is a representation of the hard disk as it exists right now. And this bottom part, this next line where you can see my cursor turns into this very strange looking movement cursor, is a place where I get to tell it what I want to have happen. I would like two things to happen to this partition. I would like to take the beginning, and you can see the cursor has changed. I'm going to click, hold, and drag, and I drug it to the front, making that partition bigger. And I'm going to take the back end and drag it to the end. Oh, come on. I had to do both again. Basically, as you can tell, the idea was to drag the front end of the partition to the front of the hard drive to use up all the available space there, and drag the back end of the partition to the back end of the drive so as to use all the free space there. The resulting partition size will then be 100 gigabytes, which, as it turns out, is the exact size of this drive. I'll click OK. And you can see now that it has one operation pending, and it is the resize/move partition B on disk 1. We will go ahead and execute that one partition, or one operation. Now, this operation tends to take a little bit longer, and the reason is actually a fairly obvious one. In my case, it turned very quick because it's a small hard drive, not a lot of data on it, and we're on an SSD. The idea is that extending a drive to use the free space that follows it is very easy, because you simply say, the drive is, it's now this big instead of this big, right? It's just make it look like it's bigger and consume the free space that happens to be at the end of it. The free space in front of it is more of a problem, because what ends up happening is you then have to move the contents of the existing partition forward. You then have to move the contents of whatever's in the partition you're starting with forward, so that it then takes up the space. It then occupies the space at the beginning of the partition, and you extend the end again to take up the free space at the end. So now we truly have a single partition on this single hard drive. 9 times out of 10, that's what people are looking for. In particular, this scenario plays out if you ever want to take a hard drive out of a machine. It's no longer the machine's primary hard drive, and you just want to put it in an external enclosure. One of the first things I do every single time when I go through that operation is I will then fire up a partition management tool of some sort and delete all of the partitions on that newly external drive, because those additional partitions simply don't make sense. If it doesn't matter whether they're recovery partitions or UEFI partitions or anything, the drive is no longer in the machine. So you no longer need UEFI boot information because you're never going to boot from that thing. You no longer need the recovery information because it's never going to be used as a recovery drive. The drive that's in the machine is the one that'll be used for that. That's just taking up space that you'd rather use for the drive itself. Hence, we go through this drive, this partition management scenario where we actually remove all the partitions except for the one we care about the most. So now I've left that here. I do want to point out I've gone through the process of very carefully maintaining the B partition throughout this entire process. In fact, if we fire up Windows Explorer and take a look at B, you can see that it's actually an old copy. It's a copy of my old C drive, right? It's got data on it. It's got stuff on it. All of that was preserved through everything we did. Every time we removed a partition, we didn't remove the B partition. Every time we grew a partition, we grew the B partition, but it was a data preserving grow of the B partition. That's because I wanted to preserve the data that was there. That's the common scenario if you're dealing with a hard drive that's inside of your machine. But if, on the other hand, you just have this random external hard drive, this random hard drive that you're going to put in a new enclosure and use as a standalone external hard drive, there's actually an easier way. And this generally does work in Windows disk management. And that, in fact, let me do it there real quick, just so that I can show you. I'm going to close EaseUS real quick, go back to disk management, because it is so obvious. I shouldn't say obvious. It's just so simple. There was one partition that we were unable to delete. This does not solve that. But for all of the partitions we are able to delete, you simply delete them. So right now I'm doing a destructive delete of the B partition. Now B doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, this entire hard drive is now unallocated space. And the next thing to do is to do a new simple volume, basically create a new disk, format that partition, and you've got a new hard drive. That's often simpler than trying to merge partitions or move partitions. It's frequently much easier, if you don't need the data on the hard drive, to simply delete all the partitions you can, take all that resulting free space and format it into a new drive, and then start using it. So that's that other alternative that I wanted to point out to you, that you don't necessarily need a third-party tool to do that. You could just go in, delete the partitions, and then reformat the resulting space into a new single partition. So back to EaseUS. And it didn't offer me the upgrade. Yay. So now let's play some with that bottom drive, disk 2. I've been saving disk 2 because this points out some of the things that are possible with respect to disk partition tools that might require a payment. So let's say, let's do two things. One, this I drive here, and I've got this 39 gigabytes of space following it. The first thing I want to do is just sort of resize the I drive so that it will take up, let's see, is it going to? No. You can tell that I don't necessarily run this tool often. There we go. E. It's not what I wanted to do. Again, allocate space. Here we go. That's what I wanted. I want to click on my iDrive. You can hear my dogs got very excited by that. I'm trying I know what I'm doing wrong. If I delete that partition, will that do the right thing? Now, is this truly unallocated, and can I extend I into it? Yes. Okay. For whatever reason, that partition that was there was still seen as a partition to EaseUS to do. So we actually had to delete the unallocated or unused partition in order to truly make it free space that we could then use. I then went over to the iDrive, right-clicked on it, and said resize/move. All I'm going to do now is take the end of the iDrive and drag it as far to the end as I possibly can so that it will then use this unallocated space when we're done. And I'm going to go ahead and execute that one operation. Since this is just making an existing partition larger, it's actually fairly quick. Now, what I really wanted to show you was this resize move. Here is I ran into a very interesting scenario, and I'm not able to replicate it. There is an approach. Let's see. We may need that to be primary. I'm sorry that this is somewhat magic. Okay. Yeah, I hate that I am making this up on the fly here. There was an interface that I came to with I'm trying to find an operation that I was able to do earlier today when I was testing this, and of course I didn't test it completely, that would actually allow me to simply drag the barriers, the boundary between partitions to resize them. In other words, have one be okay, this does that. I'm sorry, again, this is somewhat confusing. It's confusing even for me. So the scenario that I'm running into, what I'm trying to do, is take this second disk and change the relative size between H and I. In other words, I want H to get larger, which excites my dogs no ends. I want H to get larger and I to get smaller. And there is an interface here somewhere that actually allows me to drag the barrier between the two, and I'm not finding it right now. I do, however, I am able to change the allocated space between the two. I want to change the space in I want to give some of that space to H. And by doing that, this makes H larger and makes I smaller. And we hit OK. This, again, is something that the Windows tool will absolutely not be able to do. There we go. This is a fairly complicated operation when you think about it. The partition that is to the right needs to be moved back before the partition that's to the left can be extended in size. That is a complicated multi-step operation, and the tool has to be very cognizant of the fact that that only works if there's enough free space in that second partition. In other words, if the partition isn't completely full of files. And as you can see, the point that I was really trying to make here is that this is a feature that's available in their Pro version. So these are the kinds of things that you might want to consider their Pro version for. The Smart Resize is what we're talking about here. We can, I believe, do this all manually, but it becomes very tedious and very cumbersome if it's something you do often. Let's see. Right. So I'm trying to think now if there's anything else that we want to consider before we set this one to bed. I'm looking back in Windows File Explorer, or Windows Disk Management, I should say. And again, the second partition we can't do anything with. This first partition we can't even look at, but we can add a drive letter to it if we want. On the other hand, if we go to the EaseUS tool, the second tool, we can add a drive letter to it if we want to. And I'm going to do the same for the, that one doesn't have a drive letter. But it does allow you to examine the contents of the drive without needing to do anything else. Oops. This is a case now where this allocate space operation that I added here is preventing us from moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of that. Actually, I'm going to back out of both things, and then we'll go ahead and reassign the drive letter. And you can see that these have been happening occasionally as we've done some of these operations. This is simply Windows noticing that there's a new drive in the system. It's more or less the exact same thing that happens when you insert a USB stick for the first time. It says, okay, what do you want to have happen to this? And of course, there's a few things you could do since there isn't really anything special about this drive. The only thing that really makes any sense at all, of course, would be to take a look inside. Click Finish on that. And now you can see we've got a G drive, we've got this C drive, and we can move on from there. So that, in a nutshell, is what it means to deal with some of these partitions. I am finally going to go ahead and do everything I can with this drive that doesn't need an extra third-party tool. We're going to delete every partition. Every partition we can, that is. As you can see, this last one we can't. And now we're going to go ahead and create a new simple volume. Let that be E. And now we have a new volume E. That's the kind of step, or the kind of steps you would go through if you were in fact just taking an old hard drive and making an external drive out of it. So What kind of questions can I answer for you? This has been 50 minutes worth of playing with partitions. I am curious if any of that made sense. I realized that I was a little scattered there in the middle of things with EaseUS because of the interface, but I'm interested in some of your questions. So Mark Harty says, well, I need to work on partitions. I use Minitool Partition Wizard, free to use. Great. I've heard of it before. I've not used it myself. My question to you, and it might be useful for everyone, is to understand if there are any limitations or if it's truly free for all of the functionality we might need. That'd be a great recommendation if it is, and if you find it easy to use. Let's see, what else we have here. Yes, a question about ham radio work. Yes, I'm still on ham. In fact, sitting off to the corner here is my 2-meter rig, just quietly scanning a number of frequencies, but I've got the volume turned down so as not to interrupt today. Any other questions relating partitions? Any other things relating to partitioning, perhaps, that I haven't touched on, or questions that you're left with at this point? It is a confusing segment of what it means to run Windows machines these days. It also has just a bucket load of terminology that honestly I should spend a few minutes and do a better job of defining. We have seen terms fly across here such as partition, volume, disk, primary, basic, dynamic, recovery. You can even see here things like boot, page file, crash dump. Those, I hope, make a little bit of sense. Those are the default locations for, the default. This is the partition it'll boot from. This is the partition that contains the page file. This is the partition that crash dumps would go to. That part, at least, would be hopefully somewhat interesting or somewhat obvious. But others are absolutely very vague and very ambiguous. Let's see, Mark responds, all functions can resize, delete, create, and move partitions. Great. I will actually probably after this video is done, after we're done with our session here, I'll probably go grab a copy of it and give it a run through with some of the things that I've done here today. What is the main purpose of your channel? Henrik asks. I recently just stumped by and started watching. askleo is all about answering technical questions, primarily for the average consumer of Windows and the internet in general. I've been around since 2003. The website is askleo.com. I have quite literally thousands of articles written there, and I have in recent years started to delve more with answering some of the questions, or at least demonstrating some of the technologies using video. I've had the video channel for a very long time, years, literally. I think it's been at least 5 or 10 years. But it's only been recently, especially with the coronavirus quarantining going on, that I've started to dip my toe into some of these live events that act as both catalysts for more questions that I try to answer live, as you can see here, but that also then turn into questions and answers that I publish on the site and occasionally will produce more polished videos of. There are 3 kinds of videos that will result from a live event such as the one we're doing today. One is the live recording, the recording of this event in its entirety, unedited. Whatever YouTube page you're on right now, this will still be here. Shortly after I hit stop recording or end stream, then YouTube will turn it into just another video, a record of exactly what we did here today. I then take the video, I'm also recording it here separately while we're doing things. I then take the the recording that I've made and turn it into an edited version of the same topic. So for example, playing with partitions may very well turn into a shorter video that doesn't have, like this particular Q&A wouldn't be in it. It would be focused solely on the things we've been doing today, the things I've been trying to demonstrate, would take out much of the dead time, and of course the moments when I'm fumbling around. Then finally, and I'm thinking this is perhaps more likely with today's video, is that I will take the video or take the ideas that come from the video or the questions that are asked during the video and turn those into new questions and answers, sometimes with their own videos, that while they're not directly related, they're not a copy of what we're doing here, they are inspired by and resulting from the topics and things that I show and experience here today. So hope that answers the question. I hope you find it helpful. Let's see, you might be using this a lot, kind of new to stuff, just started university as an engineer. Excellent. Glad to have you here. Yes, it's been a few years since I did university, but engineering is where I started. I'm actually an electrical engineer. Any other questions that I can answer for you before we wrap up today's demonstration? I'm going to take just a minute here. In case you're not aware, I've mentioned this in previous videos. It takes about, I'll say 15 to 30 seconds, depending on between the time I say something and the time you actually see it. So if it seems like there's a lag between the time I say something or ask for a question and read your question, that's why. I have one question for you, for those of you still here. My audio meter seems to be peaking periodically. Does the audio sound like it is too high? Is it cutting out at the, getting distorted at the high volumes? If it is, then I know that I need to change or I need to adjust my volume and pay attention to my volume meter. Well, with no other questions coming in at this point, I'm going to go ahead and call this one good. I want to, okay, thank you, Henrik. I want to thank you for being here. If you do come up with questions afterwards, askleo.com is the place to go. askleo.com/ask is where you can enter your questions. I suggest strongly that you search the site first. Like I said, I have thousands of questions already answered on the site. It may very well be that your answer is already there waiting for you. If not, you can hit askleo.com/ask, or you're more than welcome to email leo@askleo.com. That will get to me. It actually ends up going into the same Q&A system that the form does, so whatever is easiest for you is the way to go. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate your attendance. I definitely want to throw a quick shout out to the patrons of askleo. askleo.com/patron is where you'll find more information on how you can become a patron of askleo and help make all of this possible. They really do help pay the bills, keep the lights on, and make askleo free for everybody else. So with that, thank you again for being here. I hope you have a great weekend. Be safe, be kind, take care. Bye-bye, everyone.